we're going to cover the two most important parts of following a gluten-free diet, which is reading food labels, because a lot of our food is packaged or has an ingredients label, as well as preventing cross-contact, which is when foods that contain gluten might touch gluten-free foods in their preparation or their serving. And we're going to talk a little bit about how patient advocates can be involved in research for nutritional aspects of the gluten-free diet. So reading food labels, I think, is still highly, highly important, despite the fact that we do have a new FDA ruling for the term gluten-free. I think this is important because mistakes still are happening. Manufacturers make mistakes. There's recalls of gluten-free products happening daily. Also, just guidance to manufacturers about providing safe gluten-free food is still evolving from the FDA and just through best practices. For example, there's still going to be a rule determined for hydrolyzed, fermented, and distilled products coming out, hopefully. Also, it's good to keep in mind that there's a very small population of the celiac and gluten-sensitive who may require a very strict gluten contamination elimination diet that may kind of limit the diet further than what I'm talking about. But the rules I'll talk about today are really good for the majority of those with celiac disease and non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So step one, when you read a label, now thankfully, is to look for the words gluten-free. How many of you look for a specific symbol on a package? Okay, how many of you are comfortable just with the little words gluten-free somewhere? All right, so what do we do? Well, a couple of recent research studies have shown that the words gluten-free are generally meaning gluten-free. So the FDA actually did a recent survey that found that almost 99% of the products on the market indeed fell below 20 parts per million of gluten, which is fantastic. This was right after the ruling was introduced, and already manufacturers are being very compliant. Another study by Thompson and Simpson in 2014 found no significant difference in the gluten-free nature of products, whether they were just labeled gluten-free or they had a specific certification. So certifications can be helpful to give, an added level of assurance, or if somebody is looking for less than 20 parts per million, such as less than 5 parts per million. But for those of us with celiac disease, less than 20 parts per million is really adequate for our long-term safety and health. And so we really don't have to have a specific label on our foods. It's important to know that wheat-free does not equal gluten-free. Hope everyone knows that. And I'm going to talk about the ingredients in labels that could signify gluten when the product is wheat-free but not gluten-free. And I still advise reading ingredient labels because, like I said, mistakes sometimes happen. Okay, so when we read the ingredients label, I've really pared it down to 5 most common ingredients to look for. Who's been overwhelmed by the multitude of ingredients that you can find on the internet that might contain gluten? Oh my gosh, I think I tried to memorize them all when I was first diagnosed, and I might have memorized half of them, but I still have people texting me when they're in the grocery store, is this gluten-free? So obviously if a ingredients label says it contains wheat, it's not gluten-free. And all products under the FDA have to say if they contain wheat. So that's a good thing of eliminating an obvious food that's not gluten-free. When we look for barley might say barley, but it also might come in the form of malt extract, malt syrup, and malt flavor. So these are really the words to look for when you're looking for barley. Notice that malt stands alone in all of these, which is different than a couple other words that sound like malt, like maltodextrin or maltose. Those are all gluten-free ingredients. You also want to look for rye, of course, brewer's yeast, which is not a gluten-free ingredient, and then oats if the product is not labeled gluten-free. So oats can't actually any longer by the FDA say gluten-free oats in the ingredients list, but the product should be labeled gluten-free if you're going to consume oats. So what if these ingredients are in a product that is labeled gluten-free? By law, this product must still test below 20 parts per million gluten, and manufacturers should be ensuring that. I've found a couple examples of mislabeled products, the most common being some imported products from Europe where malt is actually allowed in gluten-free products. So this is just an example of why it's good to read ingredient labels. But for the most part, like I said, probably around, upwards of 90% of products are correctly labeled gluten-free. So here's a couple of the tricky ingredients that I find that most people ask me about. Maltodextrin. This is a completely gluten-free ingredient, all right, in case anyone is wondering. It's almost always made from corn in the US. Even if it was made from wheat or barley, it would be so highly processed that the final product does not contain gluten. Yeast extract is typically gluten-free. There's a small chance that it could be made as a byproduct of brewer's yeast. So if you are concerned about cross-contact, you could choose only products that are labeled gluten-free, but in general, I myself feel comfortable consuming yeast extract. Caramel color is always gluten-free. It's almost always made from corn, but again, would be so highly processed that it wouldn't contain gluten in the final product. Natural flavor is very similar. Modified food starch. Generally in the US, products that are made with modified food starch are going to be from corn, tapioca, or potato if they're not made from wheat. So if it's made from wheat, it has to say wheat starch. If it just says food starch, it's most likely not from wheat and not from barley or rye. You can have wheat starch that is modified to remove gluten, and this is allowed in products, and the product can be tested, contain less than 20 parts per million gluten, and it is safe for those with celiac disease. Distilled vinegar and alcohol are safe for people with celiac disease, and dextrin is almost always gluten-free. The only exception might be in USDA foods that don't fall under the FDA, or sometimes in medications. I don't find it very often. How about this label? Warning! This product is produced in a facility. Who gets scared by this? Yeah, this is incredibly confusing. And I'm not going to give you a firm stance on this because this is actually a voluntary label that's not required on foods. The presence of such a statement doesn't mean it contains the allergen, and the absence of a statement doesn't mean it's in a dedicated facility. So it's kind of a guessing game for us consumers to know, did they put this on because there's a really high risk that it's contaminated, or did they put this on just to cover their bum? A good general advice based on some recent research quoted at the bottom is to choose, whenever possible, grain-based products that don't have that advisory and or are labeled gluten-free. The FDA found that products that contain oats, some other products like cereals, ready-made cereals and bars were more likely to be contaminated if they had that warning. Now, if a product is labeled gluten-free and it has that warning, it still has to be gluten-free. It still has to be tested to be less than 20 parts per million gluten. Okay, I'm going to touch a little bit on the other aspects of following a gluten-free diet because cross-contact is definitely an important issue. So we know that about 1/8 of a teaspoon of wheat flour contains enough gluten to damage the villi of most people with celiac disease. There is a portion of people with celiac who can't even tolerate that much, but the vast majority can tolerate that much, which is how the 20 parts per million was determined. But in general, it's important to separate preparation space, both at home and when dining out. So it's a good idea to have separate toasters and toaster ovens because of the crumbs that can be shared, things that are just difficult to clean, sifters, colanders, and baking supplies. And then condiment jars are a good thing to separate and not share with your family at home. When dining out, always ask if they prepare their gluten-free foods in separate fryers, separate pasta water, woks, toasters, and steamers. It is advisable to avoid loose airborne flours in a shared bakery or pizzeria, for example, to make sure that they at least have methods in place to separate that and not prepare the products at the same time or even within a few hours of each other. So I've gotten kind of tired of asking 100 questions at restaurants, and I've decided now to just ask them to prove to me that they prevent cross-contact. So I tend to just ask, how do you prevent cross-contact with your gluten-containing menu items? Maybe I'll say it a little less dietitian-y than that. But if they actually have procedures in place to prevent cross-contact, they're happy to tell me. They say, oh, we have separate this, separate that, we put an allergy label, yada, yada, yada. If they look at me like, I'm not, well, we can't really, then I think that's a good sign that they may not even know that there's separate procedures for preparing gluten-free food. So I like to make them prove it to me. There are, some more complicated parts of this diet that I think all of these actually need a lot more research to give a really firm evidence-based recommendation. But in terms of USDA foods, which is like meat and poultry, over 90% of them do have an ingredients label that declares allergens, and some of them will voluntarily label gluten-free, but they're not required to label allergens. So if a meat product has no allergen statement, that might be a sign that you want to look into the ingredients further. In USDA foods, you would want to look for the tricky ingredients that I referred to in the previous slide. Medications are currently not required to label allergens, though it's starting to look like from some recent research from Steve Plogstead that gluten is just not commonly used in medication. So I'm a lot less anxious about it personally than I used to be, but I think we need the definitive data to say actually how many medications potentially contain gluten. And to me, it makes sense just to have a law to disclose allergens and medications, but that's just me. Cosmetics, we don't have the evidence to say that people with celiac disease should avoid cosmetics or topical products that contain gluten. We know that gluten can't be absorbed through the skin, so you don't have to worry about it from that aspect. Sometimes people just don't like to worry about, if they could potentially ingest it, and I totally understand that. But you can't absorb it through your skin. If you have a topical reaction to wheat or something that contains wheat or oats, I would talk to your dermatologist to see if it for sure is that wheat or if it's a different reason that you're reacting to that product. And then alcohol. Alcohol is not regulated by the FDA. So far, we know that we need to choose distilled liquor, which is gluten-free if it comes from a grain source, wine, which is naturally gluten-free, or gluten-free beer or cider that are made with gluten-free ingredients. We know that we need to avoid any alcoholic beverages made with malt, which would come from barley, obviously wheat or rye as well, if they are not distilled, or gluten removed. So it's not advisable by our medical advisory board to consume alcoholic beverages that say processed to remove gluten. I think patient advocates are very important for nutrition and research in celiac disease because the treatment for our disease is diet. We will really benefit from telling researchers what we want to know and what we need to know in order to live a healthy and, most free, happy life. So think about, what you can offer to the field of nutrition research. An important part of this is the real life needs and limitations to people with celiac disease, whether it's, you live in an area where you don't have access to gluten-free foods, or gluten-free restaurants, that are able to provide gluten-free foods, the cost of gluten-free foods, the level of fortification and any vitamin and mineral deficiencies, all of those things. What do we need to answer that will be most useful to you? I think it's also important for us to expand more gluten-free diet research to larger populations other than celiac disease, such as non-celiac gluten sensitivity, functional gastrointestinal disorders like IBS, and inflammatory bowel disease, because there's a lot wider of a population following a gluten-free diet. One example of some nutrition research, and nutrition research is challenging because people don't want to follow a diet. They don't like to be told what to eat, and it's very hard to guarantee that research patients are eating only what you tell them to eat. A more common research model in nutrition is kind of surveys and asking questions about typical dietary intake. But I presented this poster at last year's International Celiac Disease Symposium. And as a clinician, I was really interested in this question for my patients, and also as someone who has celiac disease, I was concerned about some people that I were meeting who were gluten sensitive, who might not be following a gluten-free diet to the degree that I was following a gluten-free diet. So I asked the question, is there a difference in dietary compliance between those with celiac disease and those following a gluten-free diet for other reasons? And the reason why I was asking this also is because of the the increasing number of people who are following a gluten-free diet prior to being diagnosed. So I wondered, if you don't have a diagnosis, is there any harm to following a gluten-free diet for the rest of your life? I used an online survey using a previously validated tool that measures dietary compliance for those in celiac disease. And I did, in fact, find that those with celiac were significantly more likely to be adherent to the gluten-free diet than those without a celiac diagnosis, even if they identified as, their quality of life and their health was very important to them, and following a gluten-free diet was very important to their health. So I think, this potentially shows the need for an increased diagnosis rate and just suggests that there are gaps between the way that people with celiac disease follow a gluten-free diet and people with non-celiac gluten sensitivity or following a gluten-free diet for other reasons might be following a gluten-free diet.